American troops laughed when they first saw the Viet Cong scavenging unexploded American shells. To them, it looked desperate, like jungle peasants trying to fight a superpower with scraps. But soon, the laughter stopped. Convoys began vanishing on roads that had been safe the day before. Patrols disappeared in the thick green silence, leaving behind only craters and twisted metal. When investigators arrived, they found the unthinkable: fragments of American-made bombs wired together, buried deep in the mud. The same shells the U.S. Air Force had dropped weeks earlier were now detonating under American boots. Every explosion was a brutal reminder that the jungle didn't waste anything, not even the weapons meant to destroy it. To understand how it happened, we have to go back to the early days of the Vietnam War.
By the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War had transformed from a brief advisory mission into a grinding conflict that consumed entire provinces. The United States, armed with the most advanced technology on Earth, believed overwhelming firepower could break the enemy's will. Every day, American bombers like the B-52 Stratofortress thundered across the skies of North and South Vietnam, dropping thousands of tons of explosives onto suspected Viet Cong strongholds. The airstrikes were meant to crush the insurgency, to burn the jungle, destroy supply routes, and leave nothing for the enemy to hide behind. But the land itself seemed to resist. The dense canopy swallowed sound, the heat melted metal, and the enemy, the Viet Cong, vanished into the earth. They lived beneath the surface, moving through a labyrinth of tunnels, striking suddenly and fading before retaliation could even begin. To American commanders, it was an invisible war. To the Viet Cong, it was survival perfected. Each bombing run left behind something more than destruction. Thousands of bombs failed to detonate, their fuses rusted, their casings buried deep in the soil, their deadly cores still intact. To U.S. pilots, they were just duds, a statistical inevitability in war. But to the Viet Cong, they were an opportunity, a gift from the very enemy who sought to annihilate them. In the early years, American engineers underestimated just how resourceful their opponents could be. Reports from the field spoke of crude booby traps, bamboo spikes, tripwire grenades, and hidden pits. They were terrifying, but primitive. What the Americans didn't realize was that these were just the beginning. The Viet Cong's underground workshops were evolving, transforming the detritus of war into a new kind of weapon. They began collecting unexploded shells from the jungles, rice paddies, and cratered hillsides, artillery rounds, aerial bombs, even mortar fragments. With limited tools and enormous risk, local guerrillas carefully extracted the explosives, sometimes using little more than a hammer and a prayer. The recovered materials were melted, reshaped, and reassembled into improvised mines and command-detonated charges. The bombs that once fell from the skies were reborn in the shadows of the jungle. American patrols began to notice patterns. Roads that had once been secure suddenly became death traps. Vehicles that drove the same route for weeks were blown apart by mines triggered remotely from the tree line. Engineers grew suspicious. The power of the explosions didn't match what the Viet Cong were supposed to have. The shrapnel looked too heavy, too well made. And soon, fragments of steel with English markings began turning up in the debris. This was the cruel irony of Vietnam. America's own technology was feeding the very war it was trying to end. Each new bombing campaign provided the raw materials for the next wave of Viet Cong traps. Every ton of steel that rained from the sky eventually found its way back into the fight, only this time it was pointed in the opposite direction. By 1967, U.S. forces were caught in a paradox. The harder they struck, the more the jungle struck back. The Viet Cong had turned the waste of modern warfare into a weapon of defiance. and what began as scattered acts of ingenuity would soon evolve into a deadly network of minefields, ambushes, and sabotage that no amount of technology could fully suppress.
Deep in the jungles of South Vietnam, far from the reach of American supply convoys, the Viet Cong were building a hidden industry of war. In the darkness of their underground workshops, men and women worked side by side beneath flickering oil lamps. The air was thick with the smell of metal dust and burnt powder. Every sound, every hammer strike, every hiss of molten explosive carried the weight of danger. They weren't crafting weapons from scratch. They were resurrecting them. What the U.S. military dropped from 30,000 feet became the foundation of a guerrilla arsenal. Unexploded 500-pound bombs were dug up and dragged by hand through the jungle. Smaller shells were carried on bicycles, hidden under baskets of rice or stacks of firewood. The Viet Cong didn't have the luxury of modern tools. Instead, they relied on patience, ingenuity, and a fatalistic courage. One wrong move meant instant death, yet they continued, day after day. Former guerrillas would later recall how they defused American bombs using nothing but bamboo sticks and water buckets. They would tap the fuses gently, cooling the casings to avoid accidental detonation. The extracted TNT or Composition B was melted down over low heat, stirred with wooden rods, and poured into new containers. Empty artillery shells, tin cans, or even sections of bamboo. In makeshift molds they pressed nails, scrap metal, or stones into the explosive mix to create devastating shrapnel charges. Each device was unique, and each one carried a message. Your weapons belong to us now. As their techniques improved, the Viet Cong began producing increasingly sophisticated mines. Some were triggered by pressure plates made from discarded ration tins. Others were command-detonated with simple electrical wires that ran for hundreds of feet through the undergrowth, linked to a hidden observer. They also built improvised claymore-style mines, explosive charges packed with ball bearings and steel fragments, designed to unleash a fan-shaped wall of death on ambushed patrols. American engineers were stunned when they examined the remains of these traps. The level of craftsmanship was far beyond what they expected from an enemy often portrayed as primitive. Many devices used parts salvaged directly from U.S. ordnance, detonators, fuses, and wiring. The result was a weapon that combined Western precision with guerrilla adaptability. But perhaps the most terrifying innovation was psychological. The Viet Cong didn't just want to destroy, they wanted to make the Americans afraid of every step they took. A soldier could walk the same jungle path 100 times, and on the 101st it would explode beneath him. A single mine could halt an entire column for hours, forcing engineers to crawl forward with probes and metal detectors, never knowing which inch of ground hid death. For every booby trap they found, another 2 waited undiscovered. Some were buried beneath corpses or disguised as friendly equipment. Others were timed to detonate after rescue teams arrived, maximizing chaos. The Americans began to realize that the war wasn't just being fought with bullets, it was being fought with fear. Reports from the field told chilling stories. In one incident near Cu Chi, a U.S. patrol clearing an area after a bombing run discovered a crater lined with fresh dirt. Moments later, an explosion ripped through the clearing, killing 6 men instantly.
The source was later identified as a repurposed 250-pound American bomb. Its original markings, U.S. Navy, 1966, were still visible on the fragments recovered from the scene. Each encounter forced U.S. forces to adapt. Engineers introduced heavier mine-clearing vehicles, flamethrowers, and metal detectors. But the Viet Cong countered with even greater cunning, building wooden-cased mines that couldn't be detected by metal sensors, or wiring devices to tripwires so thin they disappeared in the undergrowth. It became a contest of wits, fought inch by inch, where every advantage turned into a weakness. Captured manuals from Viet Cong units revealed a level of organization few Americans imagined. The documents outlined step-by-step methods for converting American ordnance into usable weapons. They described fuse types, explosive yields, and even safety precautions. In some areas, entire bomb recovery units were formed, groups of specialists trained to locate and dismantle duds before U.S. forces could destroy them. The irony deepened when U.S. soldiers realized that many of the tools used by the Viet Cong, pliers, cutting blades, even detonator cords, came from captured American supply depots. The enemy wasn't just surviving off the land, they were surviving off the very army that sought to eliminate them. What made the phenomenon even more striking was its scale. By 1968, intelligence estimates suggested that nearly one-third of all Viet Cong explosive devices originated from recycled American munitions. In some regions, the figure was even higher. Every bomb drop, every artillery barrage fed this invisible supply chain. To the U.S. military, it was an infuriating paradox. The Air Force's relentless bombing campaigns, designed to starve the Viet Cong of resources, were unintentionally arming them. The more America bombed, the stronger the guerrillas became. For the men on the ground, the realization was devastating. Soldiers began to question not just their safety, but the logic of the entire war. How do you fight an enemy who turns your own weapons against you? How do you claim victory when every crater, every shell, and every scrap of steel can rise from the mud to strike back? By late 1968, the landscape of Vietnam had become a deadly machine, one powered by American technology, rebuilt by Vietnamese hands, and fueled by an unbreakable will to resist. And as the war dragged on, the ingenuity of these recycled weapons would set the stage for some of the most shocking encounters of the entire conflict.
It was the dry season of 1968, along a dusty stretch of Highway 13, a lifeline that connected Saigon to the northern provinces. The Americans called it Thunder Road. To the Viet Cong, it was the hunting ground. That morning, the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, prepared for a routine convoy run. Armored personnel carriers rumbled in line formation, engines roaring through the haze. Helicopters circled above, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. To the men below, it was another day of sweat, tension, and waiting. The first hours passed without incident. The jungle was unnervingly quiet. Too quiet. A few soldiers joked about it, half in relief, half in dread. Then, at precisely 0947 hours, the world erupted. A blinding flash tore through the column, followed by a concussion that lifted an M113 armored carrier clear off the ground. The explosion was massive, far beyond what any known Viet Cong mine could produce. Shrapnel ripped through vehicles and men alike, the blast wave flattening everything within 50 meters. When the dust cleared, there was nothing left of the lead vehicle but a smoking crater. The survivors scrambled for cover, firing wildly into the tree line. But there was no enemy in sight, only echoing gunfire, shifting shadows, and the endless roar of chaos. Seconds later, another detonation rocked the convoy from the rear. 2 trucks burst into flames, ammunition cooking off in a chain of explosions. Soldiers screamed for medics, their radios crackling with panic. Then came the ambush. From concealed bunkers along the tree line, Viet Cong opened fire with AK-47s and RPGs, striking with brutal precision. The Americans were trapped, pinned between burning wreckage and an invisible foe. The air filled with the stench of smoke, diesel, and blood. The convoy commander, Walter Rains, tried to rally his men. "Return fire! Form a perimeter!" he shouted, his voice almost drowned by the noise. But the ground itself seemed to betray them. Every step could trigger another hidden device. The engineers had warned them. The enemy was now using American-made bombs, rigged to devastate entire convoys. Rains crawled to the crater left by the first blast. Inside, he saw something that froze him to the core. Fragments of steel casing stamped with U.S. markings. The letters were still legible through the soot. 500 LBGP, U.S. Navy. The realization hit him harder than the blast. They had been destroyed by their own weapon. In the hours that followed, the battle became a nightmare. Medevac helicopters hovered above, taking fire as they tried to land. The jungle around them erupted in secondary explosions, hidden charges wired to the same bomb fragments that had started it all. Every movement forward was a gamble between life and death. One soldier later wrote in his diary, "It's like fighting ghosts armed with our own bombs. You can't see them, can't outgun them. You just wait for the earth to open up beneath you." By noon, reinforcements from nearby bases arrived supported by air cover. Jets screamed overhead, dropping ordnance on suspected enemy positions. But even as the earth trembled from the airstrikes, the Viet Cong melted away, disappearing into the tunnels, leaving behind a battlefield littered with the irony of American steel. Investigators later pieced together what had happened. The Viet Cong had spent weeks salvaging unexploded ordnance from previous bombings. Using primitive tools, they had extracted hundreds of pounds of explosive material and assembled it into massive command-detonated mines. Each device was buried deep beneath the road, triggered by concealed wires running through the jungle to hidden bunkers. When the convoy rolled into position, the detonators were activated simultaneously, a symphony of destruction crafted from American technology. The scale of the attack stunned U.S. command.
The craters measured nearly 20 feet across, with shockwaves strong enough to flip armored vehicles. Analysis confirmed that the explosive composition matched that of U.S. Mark 82 bombs, the same type routinely dropped in bombing campaigns. Somehow, the Viet Cong had managed to repurpose one of these bombs almost entirely intact. To the soldiers who survived, the psychological impact was just as severe as the physical. They had always feared ambushes, but this was different. This was betrayal by their own machines. Every explosion was a grim reminder that the very weapons meant to protect them had become the enemy's deadliest ally. One survivor, Sergeant Paul Merritt, later recalled, "We stopped believing in safe ground. You could clear a road 100 times, and still it'd get you the next day. They didn't just use our bombs,
They used our confidence against us. In the following weeks, the U.S. military launched extensive countermeasures. Roads were swept daily with mine detectors and dogs. Bomb disposal units scoured the countryside to locate and destroy duds before the Viet Cong could reach them. Yet for every one they neutralized, dozens more remained hidden in the earth, waiting. The Americans soon learned that even the safest routes could become killing zones overnight. The Viet Cong had turned every bomb crater into a workshop, every patch of jungle into a potential trap. No amount of technology could erase that fear. As the sun set on Thunder Road that evening, black smoke drifted above the tree line. The jungle had swallowed the dead, the silence returning as if nothing had happened. But beneath that calm lay a terrible truth. The war was no longer a contest of strength or firepower. It was a war of adaptation, and in that war, the Viet Cong were unmatched. The soldiers who returned to base that night were changed men. They spoke little, their faces gray with exhaustion and disbelief. Among them, one mechanic held up a piece of twisted metal he had pulled from the blast site, a jagged shell fragment with "Made in USA" etched across it. He turned it over in his hands and said quietly, "We're bombing ourselves out here." Those words spread through the ranks like wildfire. They captured the essence of a war that defied logic, where victory and defeat shared the same weapons. From that day on, the sound of an explosion in the distance no longer brought relief. It brought dread. Because the soldiers knew, somewhere out there, in the green maze of Vietnam, the enemy was still collecting their bombs, reshaping them, and waiting for the next convoy to come down the road. And every explosion would tell the same story, one of ingenuity, defiance, and the brutal irony of modern war.
When the smoke cleared along Thunder Road, the silence that followed was heavier than the explosions themselves. The surviving soldiers walked among the wreckage, staring at the twisted steel and scorched helmets scattered across the red dirt. What haunted them most wasn't just the loss of their brothers. It was what they found buried in the debris. Fragments of American bombs reshaped into traps that had turned their own strength into weakness. In the days that followed, military engineers and intelligence officers arrived to investigate. What they uncovered was sobering. The Viet Cong hadn't stumbled onto a clever trick. They had built an entire logistics network dedicated to harvesting unexploded ordnance. Teams of specialists worked in shifts, retrieving, dismantling, and redistributing American bombs across the countryside. The materials came from every branch of the U.S. military: Air Force strikes, Navy bombardments, and Army artillery. Each failure to detonate became a weapon waiting to be reborn. The scale of it was staggering. American records later estimated that as much as 10% of all bombs dropped on Vietnam failed to explode. Millions of pounds of high explosives buried beneath jungles, villages, and rice paddies. To the Viet Cong, that wasn't waste. It was a national reserve of firepower, courtesy of the enemy. In response, U.S. forces launched massive ordnance clearance operations, attempting to deny the Viet Cong their deadly supply. But the effort was nearly impossible. Every rainstorm shifted the ground. Every crater hid new dangers. Even when teams cleared one area, the guerrillas would move in at night and recover what was left. The jungle was alive with scavengers of war, always one step ahead. For the men who fought there, the psychological toll was immense. The line between attacker and victim blurred. Soldiers who once trusted the overwhelming power of American technology began to see it as a curse. Each bombing raid, meant to crush the enemy, risked planting the seeds for the next ambush. As one infantryman later put it, "Every time we dropped a bomb, we wondered how long before it came back for us." The paradox didn't go unnoticed in Washington. Reports from the field described a war feeding on itself, a technological juggernaut defeated not by superior weapons, but by adaptation. American commanders were forced to rethink their strategies, focusing less on firepower and more on controlling territory. But by then, the damage had been done, not just in losses, but in morale. Even decades later, the legacy of those repurposed bombs endures. Long after the war ended, unexploded American ordnance continued to claim lives across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Children at play, farmers tilling their fields, many fell victim to the same weapons that had once devastated the jungle. For them, the war never truly ended. For the Americans, it was a lesson written in blood. That dominance in technology means nothing without understanding the ground it falls upon. In Vietnam, the jungle absorbed everything: bombs, bullets, and even the pride of a superpower, and gave it back in the form of relentless resistance. What began as an act of desperation by the Viet Cong became a symbol of their ingenuity and endurance. They had turned the tools of destruction into instruments of survival, proving that in war, the side with less can still outthink the side with more. By the time the United States withdrew, the echoes of those explosions still lingered, not just in the soil of Vietnam, but in the minds of the soldiers who had walked that haunted road. And every time they remembered the sound of a bomb detonating beneath their feet, they were reminded of one chilling truth. In Vietnam, nothing the Americans left behind ever stayed theirs for long.
As the years passed, the jungle reclaimed the battlefields, wrapping its green fingers around rusted tanks and forgotten craters. But beneath that calm surface, the ghosts of the war remained, silent, buried, and waiting. The same bombs that once tore through villages now slept beneath rice paddies, a deadly inheritance from a war that refused to fade. For the men who fought there, memories of Vietnam never softened. They remembered the smell of gunpowder, the tremor in the earth before an explosion, and the sickening realization that the weapon that killed their brothers once bore the stamp "Made in the USA." It was a truth too bitter to swallow, that America's own arsenal had been turned against its soldiers. The Viet Cong's use of American shells wasn't just a tactic, it was a message, a reminder that ingenuity can outlast technology, and that every empire leaves behind the tools of its undoing. Today, in the scattered fields of Southeast Asia, demining teams still uncover those relics, corroded shells, silent witnesses to a time when the line between power and vulnerability blurred forever. And as another bomb is defused, the world is reminded of one haunting lesson from Vietnam. In war, the debris of victory and defeat are often the same.